Masechet Baba Mesia Daf Pe Tet. We saw that there's a law that one is not allowed to muzzle an animal while it's working, while it's threshing. Lo tachsom shor bedisho. And it's interesting that it says specifically threshing. It could have just said lo tachsom shor. Don't muzzle an ox anytime. Does that mean only when it's working on grain that is detached from the ground? So we saw that the last opinion, we saw other opinions too, that we're going to derive that there are two laws, and we're going to derive one from each other. There's a law also regarding humans, that a human worker, he has to be allowed to eat while he's working. And for that, it makes it in reference to the time of harvest. The worker can eat grapes while he is harvesting them. So even though that's the context where it's still attached to the ground and he's detaching it, so does that mean that he can only work at that point, but not if it's detached? So we saw yesterday that, in fact, the law regarding animals and the law regarding humans is the same. We compare chosem la nechsam, and therefore the pasuk regarding animals that mentions a bedisha, that's the word dayish here, applies to humans as well. Okay, so now we're going to expand on that and wonder, this pasuk, lo tachsom shor bedisha, although in context it applies to animals, we said it applies to humans as well. What is it coming to teach us? Tenor banan. We're going to see four versions of this baraita. So here's number one. Dayish ma dayish miyuchad davar shegidule karka ubishat gemar melacha upoel ochel bo af kol shegidule karka poel ochel bo. First baraita teaches that the law regarding animals, which also applies to humans, has to mention threshing so that we can define what kind of work is this talking about. Just like threshing is something that grows from the ground. You only thresh things that grow from the ground, grain, and it's at the time of at the time of the completion of the production. You're threshing. That's part of the completion of the production. Once you thresh it, then you winnow, and then you're going to pile it up. So it's not before harvesting, and it's not after being piled up. It's during the time of completion. And in that case, a worker can eat from it. So too, we can expand that to all things that grow from the ground. So too, a worker can eat from it. Notice it doesn't say that it's at the time of completion. In fact, these words at the time of completion are in parentheses in the standard, in the Vilna edition, and taken out, not in other versions. And it looks like it's actually belongs to the next baraita that will focus on these words. If we look at the manuscripts, you can see that the early printed editions, these two lines have it. The Vilna edition had it, but it's in parentheses. It's taken, meaning it should be skipped. And you see that actually in manuscripts, some of the best manuscripts like Hamburg and this Geniza fragment do have those words in them. So maybe it is original, because it's not, even though it's not being focused on now, it will be the focus in the next baraita. But there are also versions that don't have it. Okay, in any case, so from here we're going to expand the law that is not only regarding threshing, but anything that grows from the ground. What does that exclude? This will exclude someone who milks a cow and makes butter or makes cheese. Because these do not grow from the ground, the worker is not allowed to eat from that. While he's churning butter, he wants to eat some butter. No, not allowed. This is not something that grows from the ground. Okay, so we can learn that from this extra word, threshing, that is not specifically, it doesn't mean specifically only when it's threshing. It applies to a human also. And it means that it's anything that grows from the ground, but excludes things that don't grow from the ground. But now we challenge this baraita. Lamali ki tabo bekerem re'echa nafka. I could learn this from the pasuk about a human worker, where it says, if you come to your neighbor's vineyard and you're harvesting the grapes there, so then you can eat some of the grapes. So I already can figure out from there, grapes are things that grow from the ground, so too anything that grows from the ground, and therefore not milk and cheese. So why do I need the pasuk dayish for this? And the answer is, istirich sakada techamina. Hoil uchtiv kama, lerabot kol bale kama, lerabot name midi delav gidule karkaninhu kamashmalan. Because a pasuk regarding a human worker in a grain field, it says the standing grain, and and so that comes to include anything that stands. Even I might have thought, even if it doesn't grow from the ground. Well, what stands that doesn't grow from the ground? Animals do. Animals stand up. And they don't grow from the ground, and therefore I might have thought that dealing with animals, dealing with the milk that comes from the animals, maybe the worker can eat from the animals if he does shechita, or from the milk that comes from the animals. So therefore, kamash malan, that's why I need the pasuk daish to say no, only not something that stands up, but only something that grows from the ground. Happens to be that grain is standing up on the ground, is different from other fruits and vegetables that grow in different ways. But the point is that anything that grows there has to be something that grows from the ground. Only then can the worker eat, but otherwise not. Second version, Tanya idach, second baraita. Daish, ma daish miyuchad davar shebishat gemar melacha poel ochel bo, av kol shu bishat gemar melacha poel ochel bo. You see, here's the phrase that we were just talking about, that some erase from the first baraita, is the focus of this baraita. So why do we need this pasuk regarding an animal that says threshing floor? Just like the act of threshing is done at the time of completion, while you're completing the work, the production, so too, anytime a worker is working on the completion, at the completion stage of its processing. This will exclude someone who is pruning. Pruning is done while something is growing and you want it to grow better. So you take out the thorns and the bad fruits so that the tree won't waste energy on the bad stuff, and it will make the good fruit better. So this is before it's ready to harvest. It's not yet ripe. In the case of garlics and onions, also, someone would be taking out the weeds from the garlics and onions, and that means that the garlic and onion are not yet ready. They're not ready to harvest, so this is not the time of the finishing of production, and therefore the owner, the worker, cannot eat. If he pulls out some bad onions and bad garlics, he cannot eat them. So, lamali, hold on, why do I need Daesh to teach me that? I could figure that out from the laws regarding the worker, the human worker. The pasuk regarding grapes says you can put them in the vessel of the owner, but don't put them in your own vessel. No, you can eat as many as you want there while you're in the field, but you cannot put them in your own vessel to take home, to eat later. You cannot collect them. You have to put them only in the vessel of the owner for him. Okay, so I could figure it out from there. So you see here, what are you allowed to eat? Only things that would be at the time of harvesting, when you are putting things in a basket to save them. That's the time of harvesting when everything is ripe. That would not include, you would not put in a basket the thorns and the bad garlics and onions that you're removing from the field at the time of pruning. So I could figure that out, this law out. I don't need the word daish for that. Oh, when we're talking about a case where he is taking out small garlics and onions from the bigger ones so that there'll be more room for the big ones to grow nicely. And these small ones, they're not going to grow anymore anyway. Now, these small ones are edible, and he is collecting them and putting it in a basket for the owner. So in that sense, these small ones are ready. However, the worker cannot eat from them because the general harvest is not ready. He's not taking them out for their own sake, for these small ones, because we really want these. His main purpose is to take them out to make the big ones healthier and grow more. And therefore, I need the word daish to teach me that it's only at the end. If I only had kel yicha lo titen, I might have thought that the small ones I am putting in the basket for the owner, so maybe I can eat from them. No, daish says only if it's at the time of the harvesting of all of them. Good. Third baraita, Tanya idach, daish, ma daish miyuchad davar shelo nigmera melachto lemaaser, poel ochel bo, av kol shelo nigmera melachto lemaaser, poel ochel bo. Daish, what's special, what's unique about threshing? It's something that is not, the processing is not yet finished for the law of maaser, meaning the owner himself is allowed to eat from some of the grain, while it's still processing until it finishes the processing. That means that all the time that it's being plucked and threshed and winnowed and piled up until it's finished piling up and you smooth out the pile, only then is it liable to maaser. So just like this is that is not yet liable to maaser, and during that time a worker can eat it, so too this we generalize to any case where the produce is not yet completed for the law of maaser. Then that's parallel to the law of the worker. It's not simply because he's allowed to eat it because he doesn't have to give maaser. That's true also. I mean, a worker, once it's liable to maaser, nobody could eat it, not the worker, not the owner, without taking maaser. But the point here is more than that. That the worker is not considered stealing from the owner as long as it's also in the processing. It happens to be that it's the same deadline for maaser. When you have to start giving maaser is the same deadline as when the worker is allowed to eat it. Okay. Yasa, what does that exclude? Habodel bitmarim uba gero to'il v'nigmera melachto l'maaser en po'el ochel bo. This is someone who's separating the dried dates and figs. The dates and figs, you gather them all together, then they get stuck together while they're drying out, and now a worker has to go and pry them apart. So that worker, since it's finished, that's considered the finishing stage. It's already done the finishing stage, and so you have to give maaser. Therefore, the worker, while he's prying them apart, is not allowed to go and eat some dates and figs. So now we don't ask the same question as before, that you could learn this from the other Pesukim, a different question. We have a contradiction with another Baraita that says, if someone is separating dates and figs, then the worker is allowed to eat from them. Amar Papa, Kitanyahi betoch lane. The Papa says that Baraita that says you're permitted is talking about unripe dates. Sometimes dates are they're not ripening on the tree. You pluck them and you put them out in the sun in order to ripen. Since they're not yet edible, they're not yet finished. So in that case, since the production stage is not yet finished, the worker who's now prying them apart is allowed to eat them, because it doesn't contradict what we said here, right? They wouldn't be liable to maaser either just yet. They're not finished their production, so the worker can eat them. But if we're talking about ripened dates that are now, and they're finished, they're edible, and they already put them out to dry, and now you're just separating them, well, in that case, it's chayav maaser, and the worker cannot eat them anymore. Tanya idach, and the final baraita, daish. מה דאיש מיוחד דבר שלא נגמרה מלאכתו לחלה ופועל אוכל בו, אף כל דבר שלא נגמרה מלאכתו לחלה פועל אוכל בו. So daish, what's special about threshing? It's something that is not yet completed sufficiently that it would be liable to take chala. And so instead of maaser, we're focusing on the obligation for chala. Chala only begins when you need when you make the dough into a bowl. And then now you mixed the flour. You did all the stages before and ground it into flour, mixed it with water, made a ball of dough. Only from then on, you have to take challah. So before that, so winnowing, threshing is before that, and the worker can eat it. So too, as long as the production stage is not yet ready for the obligation of challah, a worker can eat it. What would that exclude? Yasa halash v'hamkatef ha'ofef shenigmara melachto lechala de'en po'el ochel bo. So that would exclude someone who's kneading the dough, smoothing it over, baking it. In all those cases, that's past the time when it can be past the time when you have to bring challah, and so a worker cannot eat it. If someone's a baker working for someone else and using, making dough and rolling out the dough and baking it, he's a worker, but he cannot eat from it because it already is liable to challah. Now we ask, this doesn't make any sense because the obligation for challah kicks in after the obligation for maaser. And we already just said that once something is smoothed out, that's it. You have to give maaser. The worker can no longer eat from it. So, of course, obviously, after you grind it and knead it, that's also after, and for sure, the worker cannot eat it. So la kashya bechus halaretz askina deleka maaser. Oh, no problem. We're talking about a case outside the land of Israel where there's no obligation to bring maaser. And so since the maaser is not a cutoff, so then we go down all the way till the beginning of the chala obligation. Yachi chala nameleka. If you're outside the land of Israel, mid deoraita chala does not apply outside the land of Israel, only mid rabbanan. So then chala would not apply either. So that would not be a relevant cutoff time. Ela leolam ba'aretz v'la kasha b'sheba shekibeshu b'sheba shechi likud. Amar mor. Sheba shekibshu sheba shechi likud nitchayevu bechala v'lo nitchayevu b'maaser. Oh, no, in fact, we're talking about in the land of Israel, but it's the early time period. It's talking about the 7 years when they conquered the land, and then another 7 years that it took Bnei Israel to divide the land. During that time, they were not yet settled on the land. And we have a statement that during those 14 years, the Bnei Israel had to bring chala, but not maaser. You have to bring chala because even when they first got into the land, they didn't have their own land. They bought some grain from the marketplace, and they made chala. Already you have to take chala. But maaser only applies once they inherit the land, once they get their divisions and they start growing things on the land. So during that time, maaser did not apply, chala did apply. So this whole baraita is relevant only to those 14 years. Now we ask an important question. Midi maaser kagarim, gemar melacha kagarim. Wait a second. The maaser, it's not because it's liable in maaser, oh, now the worker can't eat it. Rather, it's because you finished the processing. Now it happens to be that the completion of processing is the same cutoff line for you can no longer eat it until you bring maaser, and also when the worker now has to stop eating it. Happens to be the same. But even if you're in a situation, either outside the land of Israel or during those 14 years, where there's no obligation for maaser, that doesn't mean that the worker can continue eating it after that. It still you completed the processing. That's the point. So this is not a good answer. Ela amar Ravina keroch utane daish ma daish miyuchad b'shol nigmar melachto lemaaser ul chala upoel ochel bo av kol shelo nigmar melachto lemaaser ul chala poel ochel bo. Rather, Ravina says take the last two braitot and put them together into one and read it as follows. Threshing. What's special about threshing that the pasuk regarding an animal says while it's threshing, and we apply it also to human workers? Because threshing is a time when it's not yet completed its processing for the obligation of maaser and for chala. And in that case, a worker can eat it. But if, so too, any time it has not yet completed its processing for maaser and chala, a worker can still eat it. So this solves the problem because it puts maaser and chala together. Now, indeed, in pretty much almost all cases, the obligation of maaser will start before chala. But there could be a case where it's not yet completed for maaser, but you came and you already made some dough out of it in some way. So whichever comes first, that's where it will apply. But indeed, you're right. It's not that it's obligated. It's not because it's obligated maaser, but rather because you completed the processing. And maaser happens to be obligated when you complete the processing. And if you're already obligated in chala, then that also means that it was completed processing. So either one, whichever comes first, will trigger the end of the right of the worker to eat from it.
We now have a new question. We know that a worker can eat some grapes and he can eat some wheat, but can he singe the grain or the fruit in fire? He wants to toast it. Toasted grain makes it sweeter, makes it more delicious, and so is he allowed to do that and continue to eat while he's working? Is it the same as the prohibition against eating grapes with something else? We saw before that the pasuk says he can eat grapes, meaning he can eat the grapes alone. He cannot add salt or other things to the grapes to make them more delicious, because then he's going to eat way more. Rather, he has to eat the grapes alone. Okay, so fine. We can't add other ingredients and make a whole dish out of it, but he's not adding other ingredients here. He's just toasting it. Is that permitted or not? Tashema. Rashai Baal Habayit Lashkot Pa'alim Yayin Kede Shelo Yechlu Anavim Harbe. Rashin Pa'alim Letabel Pitam Besir Kede Sheyochlu Anavim Harbe. So we could learn an answer from a Braita that says that the owner is allowed to give the workers wine so that they will not eat a lot of grapes. If you give them a lot of wine, then they will eat less grapes. He can do that. And the workers have a right to dip their bread in brine so that they will eat more grapes. In other words, they can have an appetizer. It's like eating pickles or sauerkraut before a meal, as so that it opens up your appetite so that they'll eat more grapes. So if that's permitted, that they can do something so that they will eat more grapes, then wouldn't it make sense that they can also toast the fruit or toast the grains so that they will be tastier and they'll eat more? And the answer is lachshure gabra la kamibaya lan. No, that's different. That's not a proof because there it's that's talking about preparing the person. The person, you can do something to prepare yourself to eat more by eating appetizers and so on. We're asking, can you do something to prepare the food, to make the food more delicious, more edible? Yes, you can prepare a person so that he'll do more. He can eat an appetizer, but that's not a proof that you can do something, process the food by toasting it. So we still don't have an answer. Let's try again. Tashema poli mochlim anabim berashe umaniyot shelehem bilbad shelo yehabhevu ba'ur. Workers can eat grapes at the end of their rows of the vines. They get to the end, and they can. The grapes there apparently are more delicious. Maybe they're out in the sun, or while they're turning around, and so they're preparing for the next row, so they can eat some grapes there. That's fine, but they cannot singe the grapes in fire. Sounds delicious, toasted grapes. So he says here clearly you're not allowed to do it. So that's a good answer, right? We say no. Hatam mishum bitul melacha. No, that is because the reason why they cannot do it in that case is because they're in the middle of working, and then they will be neglecting their labor. They'll be stealing from the boss if they're sitting there. It's the middle of the day, and they stop. They make a fire. They're bonfire. They're toasting some grapes. It takes them a half hour. Okay, it's a half hour of work down the drain. So that's the reason why he says it's not allowed. Not because of making them tastier. We're talking about a case where, let's say, his wife and his children are there, and so this worker can take some grapes, hand it to his wife, and says, hey, you know what, can you toast this while I'm working? And then he comes back around and he eats them, and he's not taking any time away. So that's what we're asking, and this baraita might only be talking about when he's alone, he's going to lose time. So let's try another proof. Tashema lo yabhe ba'ur ve'yochal ve'lo yichmor ba'adama ve'yochal ve'lo yafrich al gabe asela ve'yochal aval mafrich al yad ve'ochel. So here we have a braita that teaches one is not allowed to singe produce in fire and eat it. You can also you're not allowed to stick it in the ground. Let's say the ground is hot on a sunny day, and that's another way of making it warm and soft and toasty. You're not allowed to do that. But what you can, you're not allowed to smash it onto a rock and eat it. Smashing it will help break it open and make it softer. So you cannot do any of those processes. But what you can do is break it off little by hand and eat. All right. So here it says clearly that one is not allowed to toast it. Isn't that a good answer? Hata mishum bitul malacha. No, this also is because he's wasting time and taking away time from doing work. That's why it's not allowed. And it makes sense from, I'm not just saying this, it makes sense from the context, because one of the items is breaking it open on a rock. So if you think that you're not allowed to do these things because it makes them sweeter, well, smashing something open on a rock, that doesn't make it sweeter. Obviously, it's only because it's taking time off out of the day. So, in fact, this answer makes sense. Now we reject that proof that this is the only possible answer, because no, in fact, when you smash a fruit on a rock, it helps open it, and it also will help soften it, which will make it a little bit sweeter. So, in fact, it is possible to interpret this baraita as referring to the prohibition against making it sweeter, in which case it would be a proof. that it's not allowed. All these things are making them taste better, and you can do something to make the grape taste better or the grain taste better. So it could be read like that, but it's not necessarily the only reading, and one could read it that they're all just wasting time, taking time from the laborer away from the worker, and that's why it's not allowed, and is not necessarily a proof for the case where the worker has his wife there who would be toasting it and taking the time. So we still don't have a foolproof answer. So one more try. Tashema. פועלים שהיו עודדים בתאנים וגודלים לתמרים בוסרים בענבים מוסקים בזיתים הרי אלו אוכלים ופטורים שהתורה זיכתה להם בפיתם לא יאכלו אלא אם כן נטלו רשות מבעל הבית ולא יספוט במלח ויאכל. So this Baraita says that laborers who are plucking figs and dates and grapes and olives, in Hebrew they are all different verbs for each one. Okay, but the point is he's harvesting any of these things, so he's allowed to eat from them, and he doesn't have to worry about patur from ma'aser, because the Torah gave it to him, right? That the Torah says that a worker is allowed to eat while he's working. The Baraita, however, prohibits the worker from eating the produce that he's picking from the owner with bread. He can't just now make a whole meal out of it and add other ingredients to it and eat that all together, unless he gets permission from the owner, right? Otherwise, he cannot do it. And also, he's not allowed to dip the fruit in salt and eat it. So this seems to be a proof that one is not allowed to do something to sweeten, to make the produce tastier. And so just like you can't put it in salt, so too you cannot singe it, toast it, and eat it. So this would indicate that it's prohibited. Is this a good proof? No. In the case of salt, you're adding another ingredient. So that we already learned that you can't add another ingredient. That's true. You can't add bread for sure. And even salt, even though it's just a little bit, you still also, that's adding an ingredient. That's the problem. But you cannot necessarily learn from here that would also be prohibited to toast it, where you're not adding any ingredients, but you're just making it a little bit tastier. So that's how we end it without giving a final answer. So now we just learned this Baraita that says one is not allowed to dip fruit into salt and eat it. But now we have a Baraita that says the opposite, and we're going to have to try to resolve this contradiction. שכרו לבשור, שכרו למסוק, שכרו ללקט, הרי זה אוכל ופטור, שהתורה זיכתה להן. כסס אחת ואחת יאכל, שתיים לא יאכל. וסופט במלח ויאכל. The question is going to be from the end here, but we need to understand the entire Baraita, because it's not actually clear which part the end of the Baraita is referring to. So let's see. The Baraita says that if someone hires workers to till and dig under the olives, so that worker cannot eat, because that's not the time of the end of the production. That means that the produce is not yet ready, so he cannot eat from it. However, if he hires a worker to harvest whatever it is, whether it's grapes or olives or any other fruit, so then the worker is allowed to eat from it, right? That's the end of production. That's when it's ready. And he does not have to worry about ma'aser, because it's not completed yet, because the Torah merits the worker to eat while he's working when it's at that time period when it's ready to harvest. Now, katzatz, if the worker and the boss made an agreement that they would be able to eat, even if it's in a case where, according to Doraita law, the worker would not be able to eat, but the owner says, it's okay, I don't mind if you eat. Let's say it's too early, before the harvest season, or something like that. And so the boss says, it's okay if you eat. So the worker is allowed to take one and eat one, only one by one. That's permitted because that's still a snack. But if he takes 2 by 2, then it's not allowed. Once you take 2 by 2, it becomes like a permanent meal. And once it's a permanent meal, then he's liable to take ma'aser. Right? That's another law of ma'aser. You can have a snack, but not a fixed meal. So a snack means only one at a time and not 2 at a time. And then the last line is, you are allowed to dip the fruit in salt. So here we have a contradiction. Before we said you're not allowed to dip it in salt because you're adding different other ingredients to it. But here it says you're allowed. Now, first let's clarify this Baraita. Ahaya. Ile masefa kevan de kasas kol hechi da ba'e lechul. Is the fact that he's allowed to dip it in salt? Is this going on the second case where he made an agreement, even though on a doraita level he's not allowed to take from the worker, from the boss, but they made an agreement. Listen, you don't mind. I don't mind if you eat, and that's okay. Well, in that case, since they made an agreement, then whatever he can do, they can stipulate whatever they want. And the boss says, yes, you can have one fruit at a time, and I don't mind if you dip it in salt. So then, certainly he can dip it in salt. But they're not going on the Torah law. So it can't be that this last line is talking about a case where they agreed. Rather, it's talking about the standard case, where he's harvesting and he's eating while he's harvesting, and he's allowed to dip it in salt. So this goes against the Baraita. We'll have a couple of answers. Amar Abaye, la kashya kan ba'aretz kan bechutz ha'la'aretz. Ba'aretz kabah sefita, bechutz ha'la'aretz la kabah sefita. The distinction between whether it's in the land or outside the land of Israel. Inside the land of Israel, where the law of Maaser applies mid-de'oraita, in that case, dipping it in salt makes it a fixed meal. And so we have to be more machmir about that. And so therefore, the Braita that we saw in the up above earlier, that said it's not allowed to dip in salt, that's talking about in the land of Israel, even if it's not, if you haven't completed the processing yet, and all that, just by dipping it in salt makes it into a fixed meal. And then once it's a fixed meal, it's prohibited to eat it without taking ma'aser, and so therefore the worker is not allowed. Whereas this braita that we just quoted is talking about a case of it's outside the land of Israel, where you don't have the problem of ma'aser, and so dipping it in the salt is not going to make it. Doesn't matter if it makes it into a fixed meal, because there's no problem of ma'aser. That's Abaye's answer. Amar Rava Amika midi devaris kabah sefita mideoraita v'chus alaris lo kabah sefita mutar lechatechila. Rava says no, that can't be. Is there any case where in the land of Israel where maaser is chayav mideoraita, so dipping in salt is going to make it into a meal and prohibited, and outside the land of Israel there are certain lands that are liable to maaser midirabanan, right? Lands nearby. That still have some status of holiness, like up in north in Syria. And so you're telling me that in those lands, outside the land of Israel, so there you can be more lenient, and dipping does not make it into a permanent meal, and it's permitted lechatechila. That doesn't make sense. We don't usually go from one extreme to the other like that. Usually you'll say, okay, if it's a Doraita place, it's totally prohibited, and if it's a Darabanan place, then you know what? Lechatechila, don't do it. But the avad, it's okay. Right? In other words, whenever the rabbis make a Darabanan law, they're going to make it similar to the Doraita law, and while they make it more lenient with the avad, they're not going to say lechatechila. Now you can do it totally. They make the Darabanan along the same lines as the Doraita, and therefore Rava does not accept that answer, and he offers his own. Ela marava ben ba'aretz ben ba'chutz la'aretz chada la kabah sefita hardeh kabah sefita. Rather, Rava says it doesn't matter whether you're in the land of Israel or outside. If you eat one, that's just a snack and it's permitted. If you eat two, it's a established meal, and that would make it chayav b'maaser, and therefore the worker is not allowed to eat it. So that's no distinction.
Kasatz ben safat uben lo safat achat ochel shetayim lo yochal. If they made a deal, meaning that it's not it's a time when midoraita the worker cannot eat it, but the boss said, I don't mind, it's okay if you eat it. You see, in this reading, we're understanding the last line, Sofet Melech Ve'ochal, as being a subcase of Ve'katzatz. So they made a deal. The reason why it matters whether they made a deal or it's a Doraita level is that if the worker is eating from because of the Torah law, then the worker is eating from the produce that belongs to the owner. He doesn't own it. Okay, so it's easier to permit it in terms of Maaser. However, when they make a deal out of it, in that case, the boss is basically paying the worker with this produce that he's allowing him to eat. Or another way to say it is he's giving up some of his wages for the benefit of the fruit, which is kind of like he's purchasing the produce that he's eating. Since he's purchasing it, and he owns it, so now that's going to make him more likely to be liable to maaser if some of these other factors are also in place, that either he is dipping it in salt or eating 2 by 2. So that's why the katzatz is significant. So if they do make a deal, now he's a purchaser, and whether he salted it or not, even if he didn't salt it, if he eats 1 at a time, that's okay, it's still a snack. If he eats 2 at a time, then that's already a permanent meal, and he cannot eat because he's liable to ma'aser. Now, lo kasas velo safat, ochel shetayim shatayim. If he did not make a deal, so he's not a purchaser, he's eating from the Torah law, which was the first baraita, the previous one, and he did not salt, then he can eat even 2 by 2. So this would explain the case of the previous baraita, where it says you're not allowed to salt it. That's because it's assuming that you're even eating 2 by 2. So don't salt it. And he's also not a purchaser. But if he would salt it, it would be a problem. So safat, if he did salt it, now this is what the second baraita is talking about. Achat ochel, shetayim lo yochal. Then he can eat 1 by 1, but not 2 by 2, as that baraita just said. And even though the owner gave him permission, so it's not because of stealing from the owner. That's okay. The owner gave him permission, but rather it's because of the law of maaser. The itbil, it became tebe lehu maaser vekav'a sefita. That's it. By dipping it, he made it into a permanent meal, and now he would have to give maaser. And so this you see that there's a lot of factors here. And so there could be very similar cases, but it makes a difference if he, number one, purchased it, and if he's dipping it and eating it 2 by 2. So through those differences, we can account for the contradiction between the two baraitot. Lastly, what's your source that eating 2 by 2 makes it into an established meal, and then you have to bring ma'aser? Amarav matana. Because the pasuk in Micha says Hashem has gathered them together like sheaves on the threshing floor. The pasuk in the original context is talking about enemies of Israel that have all ganged up, and they're all coming from different places in order to attack Israel, and it looks like it's really bad. But Micha says, don't worry about it. Hashem is gathering them together so that Israel will destroy them. Just like when you gather a lot of wheat on the threshing floor, you say, oh, look at all this wheat. But then what do? The owner comes and steps on it, the animals step on it, and smashes them up and breaks them apart. So too, you see them all gathering together. That's all just to make it easier for Israel to smash its enemies. Okay, a very relevant pasuk. But the reason we bring it here is to teach us that when you have 1 by 1, that's just a snack. But kibbesam, when you gather them together, like they all gathered together on the threshing floor, then that makes it into a permanent meal. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.